broadcasting from the Unshackled Studios in Melbourne. This is WilmsFront, brought to you by the Unshackled.net. Now here's Tim Wilms.
Hello everyone and welcome to this week's show. The date is Wednesday the 20th of May 2020. Sorry, that is the entropy playing up there. We are live on the WilmsFront YouTube channel, and we are also live on Entropy, the YouTube enhanced software. I've put the link in the live chat. It is 6:35 p.m. Melbourne time. Now, as I've commented on WilmsFront previously, we've seen lockdown restrictions around Australia begin to be relaxed. Our civil liberties have continued to be suspended during the coronavirus pandemic. However, our democratic voting rights have remained intact. Just as the coronavirus infection curve was on the rise in late March, the Electoral Commission of Queensland, the ECQ, still proceeded with compulsory attendance voting for Queensland local government elections. No community transmissions were traced to Queensland polling booths, so the elections were able to take place and all the votes counted and winners declared. Meanwhile, over in the United Kingdom, for example, they've suspended their democratic elections, local government elections, until 2021. With the infection curve now flat, there is no doubt that Queensland's first fixed date election will proceed on Saturday, October 31st this year under new fixed four-year term provisions. The election is shaping up to be one of the most critical elections for the future direction of the state. The Annastacia Palaszczuk-led Labor government is seeking a third term. Both of its election victories had only just scraped over the line into government, despite the Liberal National Party of Queensland winning 23 of the 30 Queensland House of Representatives seats at last year's May 18 federal election, which we've just passed the one-year anniversary, which helped Scott Morrison win majority government. The state election, the current two-party preferred polling is 50-50. Opposition leader Deb Frecklington, she's been in the job since the LNP's 2017 state election defeat. Some say with all of the scandals and waste of the Palaszczuk government, Frecklington should be in the box seat for the election, but that's not the case. Queensland is a diverse state demographically and electorally. Brisbane has become a Labor heartland, with the exception of the city of Brisbane itself. The Gold and Sunshine Coast are safe LNP territory, and Central and North Queensland, they always shape up to be multi-party contests with One Nation and the Katter Party in the mix there. Queensland politics garners much more national attention and analysis, in part due to the high media profiles now of Queensland journalists Peter Gleeson and Renee Villaris on Sky News and in the Courier Mail, to provide a comprehensive pre-election analysis of the Queensland political landscape. My sole featured guest on this week's WilmsFront is one of the state's top political analysts, Graham Young. He is the publisher of Online Opinion, an independent journal of Australian and political and social debate. He is also the executive director of the Australian Institute for Progress, a Brisbane-based free market policy think tank. He's been in the thick of Queensland politics in the past as a member of the State Liberal Party before it merged with the LNP. And I'll bring him now. I'm trying to unmute him here at the moment. Here we go here. Graham, welcome back to, well, welcome to WilmsFront, but welcome back on an Unshackled production.
It's great to be back.
Because I'll just recrop your picture there, because you changed the frame when I
did. Sorry, we're always improving on things up here in Queensland.
Well, I remember the last time that I know how to do it from here. The last time it was a pre-recorded during the 2017 before the 2017 Queensland state election. I can't believe a whole electoral cycle has passed us.
It's been a while, although not a lot's actually changed up here. The government's pulled a few Swifties to try and keep itself in power, but in terms of policy, it's hard to see the difference since Campbell Newman left, in fact.
And Campbell Newman, in my research for the show, I noticed he's on your Australian Institute for Progress Board of Directors now.
Campbell is, yeah. It's, I worked with him occasionally in the past. You said that I was involved with the Liberal Party before it merged with the LNP. In fact, the last time that I held any sort of office in the Liberal Party was 23 years ago now, so it's almost ancient history. But I do polling, and in my role as a pollster, I worked with Campbell the first time that he got elected to the City Council. So I guess most of your listeners realise that Campbell was Lord Mayor of Brisbane before he was then catapulted. I was going to say parachuted, but there was nothing soft about the way he came down, catapulted into state parliament. So that first election, Campbell really didn't get a lot of support from the Liberal Party itself, but a number of us who'd been instrumental in a few election wins in the 90s got pulled in to help. So I did his polling in that election, and I've had a social relationship with him since, but it wasn't really until the last couple of years when we launched his biography that I've had a lot more to do with Campbell. And the thing that you start to appreciate is how much energy and drive Campbell brought to the Liberal Party. I think it's sorely lacking that energy and drive now that he's gone. It's a bit like the Energizer Bunny ads. Take that battery out and Campbell was the battery, and the whole thing goes back into slow motion.
It's so in the past now. The Bajocki-Peterson era, the National Party, sometimes in coalition with the Liberal Party in that state, 32 years in power from 1957 to 1989. But in the 31 years since, it's been roughly 4.5 years of either the Liberal and Nationals in coalition, or now the Liberal National Party of Queensland in government. It's Wayne Goss, Peter Beattie, and now Annastacia Palaszczuk have been the longest serving premiers during that time.
Yeah, it's been frustrating. So the first time they won in 95/96, because they didn't win the general election, they were a couple of seats short. We disputed the return in Mundingborough, and we were successful in getting a re-election run there, and we won that, which then put Liz Cunningham, who was the independent member for Gladstone rather, into the box seat, and she chose the Liberal National Coalition, or the National Liberal Coalition, I should probably say, because we won more votes than the Labor Party did. So that was a minority government. I did a fair bit of the strategy, in fact, most of the strategy for that election. Then 2.5 years later, they were out of power. And one of the reasons they were out of power was because that was the rise of One Nation. So that was the 98 election. And they couldn't handle the question of Pauline Hanson. The Liberal Party went out early and said that as a matter of principle, they would give One Nation second preferences. And that was not popular in Brisbane. It was not a smart move. It was not a smart move to put the spotlight on the question of preferences. And unfortunately, because they put it there back in 1998, it's never really moved since. And one of the reasons that the party did poorly at the last election was because Tim Nichols, who was then the leader, didn't have a good answer to how they were going to deal with One Nation. So they blew up that first time for reasons of One Nation. They blew up the second time, I think, because, and they only just lost. under Campbell Newman. And I think the reason that they lost was that they didn't handle the fact that he was a difficult person well. They never went out and said to the people of Queensland, look, we know you don't like Campbell. We can understand you don't like Campbell. We find him difficult too, but he gets things done. And remember what it was like under the previous people. They never did that pitch. He fell short by a seat or so, and we got the government of Annastacia Palaszczuk. The Liberals and the LNP rather have never managed to claw back from that.
They sort of needed to sell him as a tough bastard that you may not like him, but he's fixing the state. And he was compared at the time because Tim Nichols was the treasurer at the time, because the state budget is still a mess at the moment. State debt is projected to top 90 billion. He started to undertake that, slashing the public sector, which has grown again, and he also stuck it to the local arts community as well, with cancelling the Premier's literacy awards. And he was compared to Jeff Kennett here in Victoria during the 90s, but Jeff Kennett got a bit more time to implement, and this isn't a dirty word, radical reforms, which made it easier for sort of our do-nothing Labor government under Braxton Brumby for 11 years.
Yeah, look, I think one of Campbell's problems was that Jeff was one of his close advisors. Don't know how many people know that, but he used to speak to him very frequently. And, you know, in politics, you've actually got to take circumstances as you find them, and you just can't take a model from somewhere else, another time and another place, and impose it. And that's, to a certain extent, what happened in Queensland. So you're from Victoria. You would recall that before Jeff Kennett, the state was basically broken. Everyone knew it was. You had financial institutions falling over. There were real problems. So Jeff had been regarded as a joke a lot of the time when he was opposition leader. And it was only this collapse under John Cain which allowed him to come in and then take these measures, because people said, look, we're not comfortable with what he's doing, but we realise this is an emergency. We've got to do something about it. We didn't have that situation in Queensland. No one thought that the state government was broke. Campbell hadn't really run on economic issues. There was a lot of anger with Anna Bligh. And the reason for the anger was before the election that she won, she'd said that they wouldn't privatise anything. They win the election, and then suddenly I think it was $8 billion worth of privatisation happened. People were not happy with that. They felt like they'd been lied to. You'd had a long period of Labor government too by that stage, so they were ready for a change. Campbell came along, Mr. Energy, he managed to win the election. But he didn't win the election on the basis of we have an economic emergency here. So when he then had Peter Costello and I think it was Amanda Vanstone, who did a study into Queensland, what we ought to do, and they came up with these proposals, people said, hang on, we didn't know there was a problem. So it's a classic case of coming along and saying, hey, here's a solution, and people saying, we don't need a solution. We don't need to take that tablet, we're not sick. So that was a large part of Campbell's problem. Saying that he was going to sack those public servants, that was another issue. At the same time as he was sacking those public servants and getting a lot of flack for it, a lot of the local governments, including Brisbane, but some of the surrounding local governments were also paring back on their public servants. They didn't go out there and say, we're going to pare back the public service. They just did it. They did it organically by people retiring, by reorganising things, people leaving, moving on. They got similar reductions to what Campbell did, but Campbell just wasn't smart in the way he went about it. So there were those sorts of issues here that means you can't compare Queensland to Victoria.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that to justify radical reforms and cutbacks, you basically have to be on the verge of bankruptcy. And I remember at the time when Campbell was introducing these cutbacks, that's when the first Abbott hockey budget fell completely flat, with the most memorable aspect of it, the copay. And the Australian people just didn't feel they were in a budget emergency then.
No, well, Tony used the small target strategy to a certain extent, and the small target strategy is keep the focus on your opponent. It's not have no policies, but it's keep the focus on your opponent. And the issue that he ran on was the carbon tax more than anything else, and the series of disasters that you'd seen on the Labor side. But they basically accepted a lot of the Labor agenda. So, we got stuck with the increase in costs from the NDIS when it really should have been looked at much more closely, and increases in education and health and so on, which again, arguably he shouldn't have done, but he committed to doing that. And then when he got into power, he tried to pull it back, and that's where he got into trouble, even though at the end of the day, the Senate didn't let him cut it back. So if you look at spending under every year of Tony Abbott and every year since, there's been an increase in health spending. There's been an increase in education spending. Every election, the Labor Party has run on the basis of the Liberals' cuts to services. It's been a lie, but Tony created the impression that that's what was going to happen, even though the facts belie that impression. You really, if you're going to win elections, you want to make sure you set yourself up so that you're not seen to be betraying the trust that people put in you when they elected you. So if you're going to change course, you need to have some sort of a process that gets people to understand that this is necessary. And if we don't do this, something bad will happen to us, which is one of the interesting sidelights, I guess, of the COVID situation, because a lot of people are looking at that and they're saying, we've got a disaster on our hands here economically that creates opportunities. So you see a lot of people in the renewables industry saying the way to get out of this is more green energy. And you're seeing a lot of people in business saying the way to get out of this is cut regulation and more flexible working conditions, cut taxes, those sorts of things. So everyone's looking at this and saying the public know that there is a problem. We need to give them a solution. So to a certain extent, coming out of this COVID crisis, we will see change because people will accept we do need change. And what we need to be careful is that we don't see the wrong sort of change.
That's exactly what I've been saying as well. With crisis, there's opportunities to change from a wrong track, which is just starting to peak. But there's also other opportunists during a crisis, and we've seen all particularly the state premiers of all stripes wanting to massively increase their control over people's everyday lives. It's a bit different. Obviously, the attention was on Tim Smith, Liberal MP down here, started calling Dan Andrews Dictator Dan or Chairman Dan. But there's other frustrating things with Liberal Premier Stephen Marshall and Gladys Berejiklian in New South Wales as well. And obviously, Queensland has the decisions by its Premier Annastacia Palaszczuk today have been in the news, where because the Parliament's been suspended since the pandemic was declared. It hasn't sat, has it? In
Queensland?
Yeah.
No, it's sitting this week. In fact,
it's sitting this week.
It sat a couple of weeks ago. Look, they put legislation in to allow them to go through till just before the election and not have a sitting. But I think they worked out they weren't going to get away with that. So, no, they're sitting. I think there's probably only about half the Parliament, though. I think they're rostered on so they can do social distancing.
There was their last-minute reversal of their decision to early release prisoners due to at the time of the pandemic, there was a lot of criminal justice reform advocates saying that we should release some of those prisoners earlier because the prisons can be incubators, but obviously with the curve still well and truly flat, including in Queensland, that something like that is not necessary now. She ended up making the right decision at the last minute, but it's sort of the thing where politicians they don't like to backflip, and even if it's the right decision, the media still calls them out.
Yeah, no, I've been thinking about the whole COVID situation. And what we're doing is a very unconventional way of dealing with an epidemic. So what we've done in the past isn't lock up all the healthy people as well as the sick people. We've isolated the sick people and those people who are vulnerable, and the rest of us have got on with life. And some of us have caught disease, and some of us in the past have died from it. You know, I'm actually in the age group, and I'm the gender, and I've got another complication, which means that I'm a little bit more susceptible to COVID than other people. That's not unduly worrying me. I'm living my life just as I always have, whilst keeping to the rules. But what happened in the first place was we got these alarming studies about the COVID virus, number of them that I saw published in the Lancet, suggesting that the R0, R0, I think they call it, figure could be as high as 5, and that the fatality rate could be as high as 15%. Now, you look at something like that, and with a sense of history, you say, this could be a little bit like the Black Death. We need to take emergency measures while we work out what's going on. But as time went on, we got more and more information that said, well, no, the R0 is not that high. And no, the fatality rate is nowhere near that high. There were people like John Ioannidis, who's at Stanford University, an epidemiologist, who looked at a couple of situations and said, look, it's probably similar to a bad case of the flu. But what had happened by that stage is politicians had copied each other all around the world, and they'd locked down, or they'd started to lock down. And they didn't adjust as new information came in. The only honourable exception of all of this is Sweden, really, at the moment. And time has to tell yet whether their experiment is going to be superior to some of the others. Boris Johnson was going the Swedish direction, and then he got stampeded by some bad modelling from Imperial College. And Britain went down into lockdown, even though their figures in Sweden's are not dissimilar. In fact, I think Sweden's doing a bit better than they are at the moment. But so you had politicians making decisions, but then they weren't brave enough to turn around when the facts had changed and say, look, we've made a mistake, we can loosen things off. So you were talking before about them being authoritarian. I refer to it as being a healthocracy that we're currently living in. You know, you go to see your doctor and your doctor says, this is what you should do. A lot of us do most of what our doctors say, but we don't do all of what our doctors say because we value other things just as highly as we value good health. You know, so there are people who go to their doctors, the doctors say, you've got to get more exercise, you shouldn't work as hard, stop drinking as much, don't stay up late, etc., etc., etc. People say, well, I actually value these things. Maybe my job is going to kill me sooner than it might have otherwise, but I like the money that I earn because it gives me quality of life, it gives my family quality of life, it gives my kids opportunities, it gives me pleasure. It does good things for the world. So generally speaking, we take advice from our doctors. We don't necessarily follow it because we balance up what we value. And as I say, it's not always health that we put first. You know, there's plenty of people who are glorified in our society who've put their health and their life on the line to achieve a greater good. And it's not that long since we celebrated Anzac Day, and those young men who put their lives on hold and put them on the line and ran up that beach towards people with machine guns and artillery. So long life is not something that people necessarily value above all else. Doctors, however, are trained to value life about all else. We've now got doctors telling politicians what to do. The doctors have got that frame of mind. And the politicians are risk averse because if they make the wrong decision, voters will punish them. So that's my explanation for why we're in this healthocracy, why we're being still locked down, even when the doctors are now saying, well, look, you don't need to close your borders. In fact, closing borders doesn't make much sense. You know, here we are in Queensland. We closed the border at New South Wales. They call Coolangatta and Tweed Heads the twin towns for the very good reason that most people who live in Coolangatta and most people who live in Tweed Heads don't draw a distinction about where it is they live, play and work. They do it on both sides of the border. There's a street called Boundary Street. It goes right down the border from Point Danger. There's houses on both sides of the street. People visit each other. They shop from New South Wales. They go across to Rainbow Bay. They shop at convenience stores and so on there. You know, it's an absurd thing to suggest that there's two different populations. What we should be doing is saying, look, vast swathes of the country don't have a problem with this COVID. If you're going to lock down places, if you're going to say to people, you can't travel, do it from hotspots. Don't do it from places which are completely identical to other places. That doesn't make any sense. But Annastacia Palaszczuk, in this case, is scared that if someone comes in from New South Wales and there's a death in Queensland, her head will be on the line. But the other thing she's ignoring is that by locking down, we're causing a whole lot of consequential deaths of people. You just don't see them. No one sees the mental health that's being compromised by the lockdowns. No one's seeing the suicides that are being caused by lockdowns and also the collapse of the economy. We're not seeing those people into the future who are going to be harmed by this. We're not seeing the people who are going to be harmed because they'll be pushed into poverty. And poverty is a good indicator and predictor of a decrease in lifespan, etc. Those people will get to vote, but they won't necessarily attribute their lessened standing in life and their lessened health to the Premier of Queensland either, so she won't necessarily get the blame. But if someone dies in an old people's home in the next 6 months, she will. So we've got all those sorts of psychological and social currents that are pushing us in a direction. And what we need is politicians to actually level with us. And we don't have a politician in the country who's doing that. You know, Scott Morrison's kind of edging there, but he's not prepared to go all the way for whatever reason.
Scott Morrison, when the curve was peaking, he said at his press conference when he was rolling out the restrictions that whatever we do, we've got to do for at least 6 months. That's clearly not going to be necessary now, and he seems completely at ease with winding back that proclamation. But of course, other leaders are not, such as Annastacia Palaszczuk saying she wants the state border to be closed until September. And obviously there was a lot of media attention when the New South Wales-Queensland border was first shut, with all the checkpoints coming up now. Obviously that's still in force. Have you got any information about whether that is being managed easier, or it's still frustrating a lot of people?
Well, I've been over the border since the checkpoints have been in place. You can reasonably easily get a permit to go across if you have to work in New South Wales and you're in Queensland. So it's not a huge issue, but they've got streets blocked off. You have to go through the checkpoints. So, you know, that slows interstate travel down, and that's a major inconvenience to people down there. But it's just also completely unnecessary. It's illogical. It's illogical to say that you can only have 10 people in a restaurant. You know, from my office here, there's a little restaurant strip up here, and most of them will be hard pressed to have more than 10 people in most lunchtimes. You know, it's mostly takeaway trade. Great for them. There's a restaurant, or a pub really, near here called the Norman Hotel. It advertises itself as Brisbane's worst vegetarian restaurant, and that's because it specialises in big, fat, juicy steaks. And it's been so successful at that it would probably take 200 to 300 people at capacity. Now, to say to a business like that, you can only take 10 people, doesn't make any sense at all. They could fit 100 people in there and they could be 6 metres apart and it'd still work. They might actually be able to make it work for themselves at that. It'd still work from a health point of view. So, you know, who makes up these ideas? I've got these rules. I've got no idea, but I'm pretty sure they've been copied from somewhere else. Because if we copy them from somewhere else, we can't get into trouble. And if someone else makes a silly decision to start with, we'll just replicate it, like the virus replicates.
I think our politicians, they're still trapped in the pre-COVID mindset. Is if they relax something or change something in when they've previously said this is going to last this period, this is what we've said. The public, the Australian people, obviously the media and the prominent social media commentators love to gotcha politicians. Oh, you said this 3 months ago, but look at what you're saying now. They need to get out of that, as Scott Morrison calls it, the Canberra bubble. You could just call it the political bubble. And obviously there are still deaths being recorded from coronavirus in Australia, albeit very, very slowly. But I don't think it's if there is a death in Queensland in, say, the next 3 months from coronavirus, it's not going to have the fallout that these leaders seem to fear.
We just have to be more realistic about mortality. The thing about life is that it is 100% fatal. You know the old story, 2 things you can't escape: death and taxes. Well, you can escape taxes, you can't escape death. It's just a fundamental feature of life. And some of us die sooner than we'd rather. That's a hard thing to say, but it's a fact. And this is the first time where we've effectively applied the precautionary principle to an infectious disease. You know, we have people dying from flu every year in the tens of thousands. Now, compared to that, this is a very minor manifestation. Now, they'll argue that's because we've locked down. But are we going to lock down every year when the flu comes along? Are we seriously going to do that? Or are we going to say, look, there's a risk to everything. There's a risk to driving. There's a risk to walking. There's a risk to running. There's a risk to going to the gym. There's a risk to kissing your wife. There's a risk to sending your kids off to school on their own. No, there are risks everywhere. There's probably a risk sitting in here that a meteorite might come crashing through the roof. Now, I'm not going to get too worried about a meteorite coming crashing through the roof, but we know that meteorites have hit the Earth in the past and probably caused some of the major extinction events that we've had. So these things might be remote, but they do happen. Risk is everywhere. And yet in this one instance, we have diverged from the common sense practice that as animals we've been observing for, you know, millions of years, that you go out, you take these risks, because if you don't take risks, you can't live. You know, it's not a one or the other choice. You can't have a life that's free of risk. And this one occasion, it's really stunned me that we have chosen on this particular disease to take the no risk path. It's just insane. We can't keep doing it. And the fact of the matter is that they talk about eliminating it, but you can't eliminate it. We've had coronaviruses around for a very long time. The common cold is a coronavirus. There is no vaccine against the common cold. There's no guarantee there'll be a vaccine against the COVID-19 either. But it's certainly not going to go away. It's going to be around. So the idea that we sit around and wait till either we have a vaccine or it disappears is lunatic. And if you think back to where we started, it was flatten the curve. What did flatten the curve mean? It didn't mean you're not going to catch the virus. It meant we're going to slow down the spread of the virus so that we're sure that if you do catch it, we can deal with you in the hospitals without them being overwhelmed. Somewhere, after about a month, they decided that, oh, maybe we can beat this thing and bash it down. And when you watch the news every night, they have a count on the coronavirus infections and the deaths, as though, it's a sort of reverse cricket match. Instead of trying to score as many runs as possible, you want to score as few runs. And when we get down to zero, we'll have won. Well, what the best health advice is, you'll never get down to zero. So you'll have never won in that way. And if you keep defining success as no infections, you're never going to succeed. And that will be a disaster for the country. So sometime they're going to actually have to change the narrative. They're going to have to level with us and say, well, we're never going to be able to completely deal with this thing, but we can't keep shut down forever. And if they don't change the narrative, I think you'll find that the populace will eventually.
What you've described, it's mission creep, and that's what we were sold as, that we've got to have all these shutdowns just so we can flatten the curve and not overwhelm our hospital system. As soon as the curve was flat, that should have been the end of all the shutdown restrictions. And of course, everyone forgets that basically the magic ingredient that Australia has used to flatten the coronavirus curve is suspend international travel, which a lot of other countries have not done. That's not talked about as much as it should be.
Yeah. Look, I think there's also another factor there. I don't know whether it's struck you, but it's curious that both New Zealand and Australia have extremely low rates of COVID-19 infection. And when you look at the globe and you look at countries, you see that in the Southern Hemisphere and around the equator, there's much lower rates of infection than there are, for example, in Europe and North America and Canada. And there's got to be a climate or other factor going on there. Now, with COVID, you're more likely to catch it internally, so inside, and you appear to catch it mostly from aerosols, so people breathing out. And people who cough or people who sneeze breathe out a lot more than people who are just standing there talking normally or just breathing or just reading. When you're outside, there's a much larger body of air, carries aerosols away a lot faster. So if people are outside a lot, they're unlikely to catch it. So if someone jogs past you with COVID, very low chance you're going to get a large enough load to be in trouble with it. It also doesn't do well with higher temperatures and ultraviolet radiation. We also know that vitamin D is an important factor in fighting infections, viral infections. And if you're out getting a lot of sun, you're getting a lot of vitamin D. So it's more than possible that our success with COVID-19 isn't so much anything we've done, but the fact that we were in summer when this thing struck. The places that got hit by it hard were in winter. They're now starting to come out of winter into summer, but even now you look at the temperatures in England, and even you guys down there in Victoria are probably enjoying much more balmier conditions.
Victoria is nothing compared to the coldness of England.
Yep, so you've got people inside because it's too cold to go outside. You've got low vitamin D, so easier for them to get infected. A whole range of things happening. There's a reason we have a flu season, and it's in winter. And no one seems to be, when I read the literature, no one's 100% sure why it is we get a flu season, but we do get a flu season. And these sorts of factors all play into the explanation as to why we have a flu season. This is a virus, there's likely to be a COVID season. And we may in fact be heading into the COVID season at the moment. So it's quite possible you'll actually see, as we relax, the rate of infection will go up. And the last thing we can afford is for politicians to then say, oh, sorry, got to close the economy down again.
Yeah, because we can't ever afford to do this again. That's pretty clear. Another area where Annastacia Palaszczuk has put Queensland probably out on its own is with the the no jab, no play policy for professional sports people, that they cannot come to play in Queensland unless they receive a flu vaccination. And of course there's been those that cohort of NRL players who've resisted. Queensland is an NRL state. It's also where the Western Australian and South Australian AFL teams are going to be based because of the hard border closures there. And of course, Annastacia Palaszczuk, she did the flu vaccine demonstration for the cameras. And I don't want to get into the anti-vaxxer rabbit hole as it's termed, but the flu vaccine, it doesn't protect you from the coronavirus. It protects you from the common winter flu.
Yeah, well, I think that's an example of people taking a crisis and using it to advantage. Now, I've got some sympathy with the footballers. I've never had a flu vaccine for a number of reasons. One is that there's a possibility you get just as sick with the flu vaccine as if you had the flu. And the other is that they only vaccinate you against a spectrum of flu, certainly not the overall spectrum. I've never had a bad flu experience, so I've taken a decision not to be vaccinated for the flu. I'm vaccinated for a whole lot of other things. So I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I've had my children vaccinated. But, you know, there's a whole lot of things that are necessary. And there's a whole lot of things that are voluntary. My partner just recently went overseas, and you can go to someone called a travel doctor, and they'll advise you on the various shots and so on that you can have. And Penny came home, and you know, she decided to have some but not others. She said, well, I don't think really the cost's justified by what I'm avoiding here. So, you know, it's no different from most of the other things in life. One ought to have a choice as to whether you have a flu vaccine or not. But I think what happened in the case of Queensland was that there's been a problem, well, it's Australia-wide, with childcare centres, with children not having vaccines for measles, mumps, etc., those sorts of things. So it's kind of got wrapped up in this. There's an anti-vaxxer group amongst the footballers, which the public health officials are trying to marginalise. So the fact that some of these footballers wouldn't have this vaccine was linked to the fact that some of them and their partners are against vaccines in general. And, well, hang on, we're going to make them do it as a demonstration that no one's above our health edicts. I think that's what was going on there. My point of view is that perhaps their employers could have been in a position to say, well, hang on, I think you should have it because we don't want you infecting any of your teammates and you're going to be in very close quarters with them. Well, that's an employment situation you can handle under an employment contract. But for a state government to say, you can't come here unless you've had it, that's absolutely absurd. And just while we're talking about vaccines, one of the interesting sidelights is that there is some speculation that the vaccine that we got in Queensland, I'm not sure whether you got it in Victoria, but we got this vaccine against, what's it called, tuberculosis. And there's some speculation that gives you some resistance to the COVID virus. New South Wales, it wasn't compulsory, so people down there didn't have it. And that's one potential explanation for why there was more infection in New South Wales than up here. So it's interesting the vaccines play in different ways in this issue.
Western Australia, not only did they have the hard border closure, but they also had intra-state restrictions. They split up their state into regions, and I know that George Christensen, the federal member for Dawson up in Mackay, was saying, well, if WA can do that, why can't Queensland, the region, central North Queensland, where local health is not as can handle as much capacity as down there in the southeast? Why can't we have an intrastate border closures, and Annastacia Palaszczuk said, "Oh, can't be done," even though she closed the most populous border in the state between Queensland and New South Wales. And now that we're coming out of the pandemic, she hasn't budged on this, Annastacia Palaszczuk, much to relax the restrictions more in the regions where there has been less infections.
Yeah, well, as I was saying earlier on, it would make some sense to quarantine areas which are hotspots of infection. But state borders are basically administrative borders. They're boundaries, rather. They're accidents of history as much as anything else. At one stage, there was a proposal because Queensland was split off from New South Wales. And there was a proposal that the Northern Tablelands, the New England Tablelands area of New South Wales, down to the coast somewhere around Grafton, should be part of Queensland. And I think there's some good common sense to that, but it didn't happen. So the border where it is as much an accident of politics as anything else. It doesn't define anything in terms of health. And you've got people in Western Queensland, they've never had any infections out there. Yet if you're a pub in Western Queensland, you can only have 20 people in at the moment for some obscure reason. As George Christensen was pointing out in his area, no or virtually none, no infections. Why should they be subject to the same strictures as, say, Brisbane, where we had some? So it's just further irrationality. It will probably come back to play in the state election, I think, because what we're doing with this hard border is not only is it irrational in terms of your population movements inside the state, but it's irrational in that the tourism industry is going to suffer significantly because Queensland does good tourist trade in the winter months when people from down south come up for the warmer temperature. So you've got places like Cairns, where Great Barrier Reef, you've got the hinterland, up to the Atherton Tablelands, up to Cape York. Their tourism is going to be limited to people from Queensland, and most people from Queensland probably aren't going to go up all that way. You'd have to drive up, I suppose, at the moment. I'm not sure what the air flight situation is. So when you've got an election at the end of this year and those economies are going to be devastated, they'll be looking for someone to blame. And when you look at the people who are suffering most from this, it's younger people who are a group who tend to favour Labor at the moment, but who can get quite angry about things. And it's people in less secure employment and generally the lower income employment. It's going to affect the building trade soon. So there's a lot of men, particularly young men, tradies in those industries, who, if they're given a sufficient reason to vote for someone else, may well do it. And the party in Queensland, well, there's a couple of parties actually. The party who historically has appealed to some of those groups is One Nation, and they do particularly well in North Queensland. Another party that will appeal well to them is the Katter Party. And again, they do particularly well in North Queensland. In fact, that's the only place that they do well because they're a party that sprang to life around that Mount Isa, Townsville area. So these border closures in another, how many months' time? Is it 6 months roughly? May indirectly, it won't necessarily be the border closure itself, but people will be looking for someone to blame for their diminished living standards. And it'll be the person who's in power, who's Annastacia Palaszczuk.
Certainly when we're at the peak of the pandemic and the curve, state and federal oppositions found themselves basically they didn't know how to react, because that's when I guess the slogan which we've all by now pretty much can't stand is we're all in this together. But we're now seeing the politics and the political discussion about the issues return to pre-pandemic levels. And you mentioned that Queensland Parliament is back this week, and I'm not sure if there's been any further polling, but the last two Queensland elections have been very, very close. And even though the LNP has done extremely well at the federal level for many years, not just at the last federal election, but it was the Queensland Liberal and National parties that gave John Howard the majority in the Senate. And there's plenty to be unhappy with the Palaszczuk government about, and a lot of the controversy stemmed from her former Deputy Premier and Treasurer, Jackie Trad, who has finally come undone in the past few weeks.
So in Queensland, you have a bit of a split between the urban southeast, the rural areas, and also North Queensland. Jackie Trad is the leader of the left-wing caucus in the state ALP. She's the member for South Brisbane. South Brisbane is an interesting seat. It's been the seat of premiers. Anna Bligh was the member for South Brisbane, but so was Vince Gare. Not Vince Gare. Anyway, the last Labor Premier of Queensland is split from the ALP over the communist question. Anyway, it used to be the heart of the shipping industry in Brisbane. So it was a Labor seat because of a whole lot of working class people. It's gentrified over the last, what would that be, 60 years. And now it's the heart of Green left politics. Yeah.
West End is, to put it in terms my audience might understand, West End, which is in the seat of South Brisbane and the federal seat of Griffith, is basically the Antifa headquarters of Brisbane.
Well, I haven't seen a lot of Antifa up here, I think.
that's the sort of the basic how I summarize it for my audience.
Yeah. Okay. It's oh look, it's not dissimilar to the territory that Adam Bant's in.
Fitzroy in Melbourne, Newtown.
Got a whole lot of workers' cottages and we have these wooden cottages up here. You tend to have brick and so on down there. But people think they're cute. They're easy to extend. So you can turn what was a modest working man's cottage into a mansion with the application of a whole lot more wood and tin. They're close to the city, close to public transport, and they're in short supply, so the prices go through the roof. But you've still got an interesting mix of poverty and wealth in these areas. And I'm talking about an area that I grew up in, Tim. I grew up at East Brisbane, a couple of blocks away from the Wollongabba cricket ground, it's still, I think, in Jackie's electorate where I grew up. I just live outside of these days. So it was an interesting place. I've seen it change over the years. And there's still, despite the wealth, there's still a lot of poverty. And the sort of wealthy people who move here, they actually like a little bit of poverty. They feel that they've got a bit of gritty realism going on, I think, in their lives. But they tend to be very green. They tend to be very anti-mining. They tend to be very anti-agriculture, even though they're big consumers of the good things of life. They tend to see farmers as a stereotype of vandals who damage the environment and torture their animals. When you go and talk to a fair dinkum farmer, you find that it's exactly the reverse, but that's the kind of stereotype they work on. So they don't think farmers ought to be able to manage their land, so they're in favour of stopping them clearing trees. They're against live exports, which are a big issue in North Queensland. and in fact throughout the whole state, because there's a lot of beef grown here. They're against coal mining, particularly Adani, and they want to put solar panels and wind farms all over the place. Oh, and they're against dams as well. The sorts of things that do well for a Jackie Trad down here do very poorly for the Labor Party up north. On top of that, the Greens do so well in Jackie's seat that they are a real risk to her. So that drives her even further to the left. And they're a bigger risk this election because the LNP has said that they will direct preferences to the Greens, not to Jackie. So she basically needs to get about 40% of the vote, or she won't be coming back after the next election. On top of that, Jackie's seen as basically being, or was seen anyway, as basically being the puppeteer of the state Labor Party. So, pardon me, Annastacia Palaszczuk was the figurehead, but everyone suspected that Jackie had her fingers up behind the collar of Anna's shirt and was manipulating what came out of her. And to a certain extent that's changed because Jackie has had to resign from the cabinet because she's under investigation by the CCC. Now, I'm not suggesting that she's done anything wrong and that the CCC will find that charges ought to be brought against her. And, you know, for anything serious to happen to Jackie, it's not just that the CCC make a finding, but that a court upholds that finding. But for the moment, she's been taken out of the headlines. So it changes the dynamic up here to some extent. And it also explains why the Labor Party hasn't done as well as it might like to in country areas. But it doesn't explain why the LNP hasn't managed to pick up from the ALP in those areas, why the vote's gone to minor parties mostly, being Katter and One Nation, and why Labor, despite all of this, has still managed to hold seats in Townsville and Cairns.
She'd had a previous controversy late last year about an investment property she'd bought in south of Brisbane, which was earmarked for future government development. And that was around about the time the CFMEU, their State Secretary Michael Ravbar was the union, didn't they hold a rally calling on her resignation? And it was another union leader, Gary Bullock of the United Workers Union, who delivered the fatal blow when she did resign. So it seems like that the push to oust her and hold her make sure that she was held to account or is put under proper investigation was from her own side rather than the LNP.
I don't think that Bullock was after justice. I think he was after another election win. The reason she's stood down completely is because she was becoming a liability. But, you know, you've got to draw a distinction there between them wanting to do the right thing or wanting to be seen to do the right thing. And I think it was appearances rather than substance. I would think Jackie's probably still wielding a fair bit of power behind the scenes. I don't think she's gone away. I don't think she intends to go away. I don't see how a powerful factional player like that could disappear while they're still in the parliament. And she's recontesting a seat, and if she does win despite the LNP preference deal, she'll be back again. And I think she'll make herself felt. You know, she's an extraordinarily powerful person. She's personally forceful, so I'm told. Those sort of people can rehabilitate themselves and get back into power. Maybe not without difficulty, but despite the difficulty, they can do it. So I wouldn't write Jackie off, and I wouldn't read too much into her faction telling her that she had to stand down, apart from them trying to save their own skins.
You mentioned the preference deal. The LNP is going to be directing in South Brisbane their preference to the Greens rather than Jackie Trad, which is a break from probably the consensus of the past decade, since it was Liberal preferences that elected Adam Bant in Melbourne, which I suppose is a testament to just how bad Jackie Trad is compared to the Greens. But that brings in the issue of Queensland now has full preferential voting. It used to have what New South Wales is optional preferential voting, where you could put just one, or you could put 1 to 8, however many candidates there were. And the two-party preferred just included the preferences that hadn't been exhausted. But it has led to, and that's why a lot of people don't like preferential voting, legislation passed to secure preference deals. And obviously with Jackie Trad being under threat from the Greens, the Palaszczuk government has passed laws that infringe upon farmers' rights. They even wanted to reduce the capacity of a dam as well, and which of course is.
Are you talking about the Paradise Dam?
Yes.
Oh, that's a safety issue there. I don't think they want to be doing what they're doing, but they can't escape that. The dam's structurally unsound. There are questions as to whether they should have consulted better with the people who currently depend on the dam, and that dam was put in to turn the Bundaberg area into a super area for producing fruit and vegetables. And there's been a lot of investment there, things like avocado farms and almond orchards. That was done on the basis of the dam, and now the dam is in risk of failing, so they've had to reduce the level. They did that without telling the local community. They said to the local community, look, we're going to be releasing the water, but before we release it, you can take water out. However, the time at which they said you can take water out wasn't a time when anyone needed the water. So the water basically went down the river. So, you know, there's a whole lot of bungles which illustrate that the government doesn't understand the complexities of life for people in business and people in agriculture. I doubt whether an LNP government would have handled it the same way, because there would have been plenty of people around that cabinet table who would have said, hang on, you can't just get rid of the water like that. And yes, there might be a risk of flooding, but these places flood frequently. Maybe we should go and consult with the locals and say, look, there's a 10 or 20% chance that this might fail and this will be the consequences. However, there's all this water in there. You guys need it to grow. How do we deal with this in a way where the risk is acceptable to you and the outcome's acceptable to you, and it's not unacceptable to us? They didn't do any of that. They just went in, made decisions which were not consonant with the needs of the rural community.
So it's more an overall issue that they just don't get what are basically the needs and of people in rural areas, and just don't know how to properly talk to them.
I don't think it's just rural areas. I just don't think this is a competent government. You know, I've got friends on the Labor side with a deep pedigree who say this is a bad government. It's full of people who are advisors to politicians. It's full of people who've never done anything with their life other than politics. When I look at it, it reminds me of the student union councils back when I was at university. You know, these are people who are good at winning trivial arguments, who are good at rigging the rules to favour themselves, but who are very poor at achieving anything that really matters.
We spoke at the beginning about Campbell Newman's effort to rein in the excesses of the state and the public service, and of course that's all been reversed under the Palaszczuk government, with the more public servants being put on, and I already mentioned the state debt. But of course, the way that they spin that is we've got more frontline workers.
Well, yeah, that's what they do, and that's a typical Labor pitch. I mean, for a Labor government, you can never spend enough money on services, and when Labor voters, people who are rusted on Labor, are considering who they're going to vote for, they don't look at performance; they look at expenditure. So, if you're going to be successful on the Conservative side of politics, you need to get people looking at performance, and you need to get them understanding that just spending more money on something doesn't get you a better outcome. And if you can't convince them of that, then you're always going to lose the argument. So, you know, one of the mistakes I think the LNP's made is to try and outbid the government here, not on health, but on education. So one of their policies is, let's put an extra air conditioner in every school. Well, when you've got a public mindset, which is that you're the party that always cuts in education, they're going to trust the ALP to put those air conditioners in before they trust the LNP. Now, what the LNP has to do in education is concentrate on the appalling outcomes that we're getting out of our education system in Queensland. You know, that we lag the rest of the state, we lag the rest of the world. And in fact, in historical terms, back in the 70s, we had a first-rate education system. So we lag our forebears, we lag the baby boomers in terms of what we're delivering. When it comes to health, you know, Campbell actually did a good job in health. And a lot of the credit for that has to go to the health minister at the time, Lawrence Springborg, who was a former leader of the opposition. And Lawrence got in there and he did a good job. And the way they sold it was, we'll get rid of the waiting lists. It wasn't more doctors and nurses, it was, you shouldn't have to have ambulances ramping. There should be enough capacity there. They brought in a guarantee that if we can't fix you or we can't suit you in the public hospital system within a period of time, we'll pay for it to be done in the private hospital system. He got in there and he had a fight with the doctors about the amount they were getting paid. But that was done on the basis of the outcomes that we could give people. So you've got to get into those arguments. Otherwise, Labor will just keep talking about how much extra they're going to spend. Now, the problem with those performance arguments is they're often difficult to have from opposition. They're much easier to have from government. So if you're going to win an election, often what you've got to do is just avoid those issues where Labor's going to outspend you altogether, focus on the issues where you can win. Having said that, the 95 state election, I know it's ancient history, but we were able to demonstrate that under the Goss government, there were actually fewer hospital beds after 6 years than there'd been at the beginning. So those sorts of things actually did tell. You know, they'd say, we're spending extra money. We'd say, where is it? You can't see it. If you're spending extra money, there ought to be more hospital beds. There aren't. People are dying because they can't get into your hospital. So you can win that argument, but you've got to start framing it in those terms. And at the moment, I think there are more hospital beds than there were when they got into power. So, you know, that line wouldn't work. They are getting some bang for their buck.
It reminds me when a government claims that we've spent this, we've employed these people, that that famous Yes Minister episode with the new hospital where it does all these things, but it has no patients, which is obviously that's a more absurd
well, we've achieved
example.
that with the coronavirus, Tim.
Yeah,
there's no one in hospitals. There's hospitals going broke because they can't treat anyone.
Also, it's worse in Victoria. Oh, well, it's been taken to its max in Victoria with a nationalisation of the private hospitals as well. Yeah.
Well, they've done a bit of that up here as well. But, you know, I'm hearing stories of people in emergency wards who are twiddling their thumbs because no one's driving, so there's no car accidents. No one's going to pubs, so there's no brawls. And the druggies are staying home. They're not going out and they're needing to be treated. So there's huge spare capacity at the moment in the hospital system. And again, that ought to be an issue, you know, because there are people who are dying because we're not using our hospitals properly.
So you've described in quite detail what is wrong with the Palaszczuk government, which in both our views should be enough to see it thrown out. So what does the LNP need to do to win the election? Deb Frecklington, she tries to get her face out in the media as much as possible. The way I see it, she projects a very sort of motherly persona, but it does look to a degree artificial. She's from the Darling Downs, which is in Western Queensland, just past Toowoomba. That's old Sir Joby Peterson territory. But as I know, we of course on the anniversary of the Morrison miracle, we shouldn't put too much on polls, but what does she need to do, and what does the LNP need to do in the 5 months before election day?
Yeah, she actually represents the seat that Bjelke Peterson represented. Had a different name when he was it's Nanango now, it was Barambah back then. But it's like you say, Western Queensland, the road system's that good, you can get there in an hour and a half from Brisbane. So it's really more or less southeast Queensland. And while she's a farmer, she's more a southeast Queensland person than a rural person. What does she have to do? Well, what you've got to understand about elections is that people at the end of the day vote for politicians who they think will do something for them. So you need to have enough substance that they think that whatever you promise, you'll deliver, or at the very least, that voting for you is a respectable thing to do, and you can send a message to the government by voting for you. So that's one thing she has to do. And the various appearances that she does, that's all about creating that sense of substance. But secondly, you actually have to be promising to do something for people that they want. And you've got to do that in a way that they can easily comprehend it. I think the master of political communication at the moment, although when you watch his press conferences, doesn't necessarily appear to be the case, is Donald Trump. So you know what he stands for. It's Make America Great. And Make America Great encapsulates a whole lot of different things. And it's about national security. So when he talks about building the wall, it's about being able to control your own country. Make America Great, it's about not letting other countries tell you what to do. It's about getting your industry going again. So it encompasses a whole lot of things. He doesn't have to spell policies out in detail. Just that MAGA cuts through. Deb doesn't have that theme that pulls it all together. And that's what she needs to win an election. So she needs to reach a standard that people are happy to vote for, but then she has to be able to show people that she stands for the things that they want, and she has to have that in a simple phrase which allows them to grasp it intuitively and immediately. Now, she's kind of there on the first. I wouldn't say she's all the way there, but she's certainly not there on the second. And one of the problems that I see in the presentation is I follow her on Instagram. I see her doing a whole lot of nice appearances, but they're not tied together in a story which will convince people to vote for her. It's just like anyone else's Instagram account or Facebook account. Here I am doing this, here I am doing that. Okay, so you're a regular person. We don't necessarily want a regular person. We want a leader. Show us how you're going to lead. Show us what you're going to do. She's not doing that at the moment. The party isn't doing that. They are trying to do a small target strategy so they don't put too much stuff out there that the other side can attack. They have on the COVID issue pushed a little bit to open the state up faster, so they've got their own timetable that they'd like to see the state adhering to. Certainly has the border being open sometime before September. But I don't hear them out in the media pushing Annastacia and saying, this is absurd. Open that border now. Our friends live in Tweed Heads. If you bothered to get out of your electorate and move down to the Gold Coast and talk to the people there, you'd realise they need that border open. They're not doing that kind of stuff. They don't have that theme. The other issue is they need to deal with some of the negatives that we know are going to come up and could derail the campaign. Coal mining is one of those. So if you look at where the seats are that they hold and where the seats are that they can win, the seats that they hold are, as you said earlier, Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast. They hold almost all the seats in those two areas. The other area where they hold seats is what I call rural Queensland. So I wouldn't say Western Queensland. Most of the seats are places like the Darling Downs and moving up just west of the Great Divide. So they're in the hinterland, really, of a lot of the coastal areas. If you look at a lot of these coastal seats, they go up pretty close to where those strong National Party seats are held. When you get up to Mount Isa, which is where I'm talking about Western Queensland there, that's cattle country. They're not holding that territory now. And North Queensland, they don't hold that territory. In fact, they're not even competitive outside of Townsville and Cairns. It's One Nation and Katter that are competitive there. And they don't hold any seats in Townsville or Cairns. They hold some seats a bit south of there on the coast. So the seats that are there to be won are in the southeast corner. They're Brisbane. Brisbane is not, as you said, a Liberal town. It has a Liberal council. The Liberal council has 23 of the 26 seats, 23, something like that. No, not quite that many. It might be 22 of the 26 seats in the council plus the Lord Mayoralty. Labor only has roughly 4. But when you look at the state seats, the LNP have 4. Labor has 5, that's right, in the council. LNP in the state has only 4 seats in the city of Brisbane. And when you get to the wider rim around it, which includes Redlands, Redcliffe, sort of around Caboolture, Morayfield, out to Ipswich, down to Logan City, they only have a couple of seats in that area. If you look at those seats at a federal level, they're seats like Dixon, held by Peter Dutton, where he got a swing to him. Petrie, held by Luke Howarth, who got a swing to him. Burt Mannon, down on the south in Ford, he got a swing to him. But the state Liberal Party, the state LNP, are way off the pace in those seats. So their challenge is not to get wedged, for example, by Adani, which is what they got wedged by partly in the last election. You had the Greens coming in and saying Adani's the big issue. That was all the media wanted to talk about. And the LNP didn't have an answer that would keep people in North Queensland happy and people in Brisbane happy. So that's number one. Number two is their relation with One Nation. You know, they need to have an answer which keeps people happy on that, and they don't. And I think that the answer that they can have that can win on that is partly about the culture wars, because the reason that people like Dutton win as well as they do in those seats is that they understand what drives ordinary Queenslanders, and they have an attitude and a bearing which relates to those people. And for whatever reason, the LNP isn't able to reach across to those sorts of basically working class, upper, lower middle class constituencies. And if they can't do that, then they're always going to have trouble winning in Queensland.
So you think, because post the federal election, the Palaszczuk government basically rolled over on Adani and gave all the ticks they'd been holding back, that sort of coal mining and electricity issue, because at the federal level there's quite a prominent pro-coal and also pro-nuclear LNP members such as Matt Canavan and Keith Pitt, who's the new Resources Minister. I mentioned George Christensen before, so that doesn't translate to a state the state electoral pendulum.
Well, they do. The LNP do okay in those areas where those members come from federally. Keith Pitt and Matt Canavan's based up the coast in Rockhampton, I think. They do okay there. I mean, Rockhampton's a Labor heartland, always has been. You'd be very lucky to win that. In fact, I think the only time the LNP won it was with Rex Pilbeam, who was the local mayor, and we're talking back in the 70s then. That was an extraordinary situation. But the surrounding rural areas, they do reasonably well. But it's once you get up past there, they don't do particularly well. Basically, well, just south of Townsville, north, and they kicked the member for the Whitsundays out of their party.
Yes,
I suspect he'll get re-elected.
Jason Costigan,
That's
he
right,
founded the North Queensland First Party. Was he so he? By what you've just said, he certainly hasn't been disgraced. He's just been kicked out of the party.
Well, look, there were accusations of kind of sexual impropriety. Perhaps he's done no worse than Joe Biden or Bill Clinton. But it apparently was a mortal sin in the LNP. But up in the country that he comes from, I suspect it won't do him any damage at all, and that they won't be able to dislodge him. But I could be wrong on that. I haven't been up there in maybe 20 years, so and I don't have any contacts there, so I could well be reading it wrong from here. But the seats, the number, so they need about 9 seats. Those seats, there's a couple in North Queensland that are potentials, but the bulk of them are in Brisbane and surrounds. Places where Campbell Newman did well. Places where Joh Bjelke-Petersen used to do well. But places where the Queensland Liberal Party, which was half of the LNP, didn't do very well at all. I think that, there's a bit of a hangover from that. And Deb's, I think she looks too much like a Liberal and not enough like a National, even though, as I say, she comes from a farm. And she's not talking the right language. It's just little things that you see. For example, there was a story in the Sunday Mail the other day, I think it was the Sunday Mail, saying how many women candidates the LNP had pre-selected. Now, I think Campbell Newman had a woman problem in terms of the amount of representation in his state parliamentary team, which was ironic because in his council team, he had a majority of women. But state government, I can remember going in there to listen to a friend's maiden speech and looking down and seeing a sea of blue pinstripe suits and thinking, there's something wrong going on there. Just on the balance of probabilities, there ought to be a lot more women in that group. So it has been an issue, but the sort of people that worry overly about that are the sort of people who will never vote.
Yeah, exactly.
The LNP. The people who vote for the LNP, and I've had experience of trying to broaden the board of our think tank because we didn't have a wide enough experience, and we needed a better representation of women on it. And I spoke to a woman who's been quite successful in the local government elections, actually, and she took umbrage when I said, we're looking to expand it. It was, hang on, I'm worth having on your board because of who I am, not because of my gender. And that's the attitude that people on the LNP side of the fence most often have. So to go out there and do a deliberate pitch to a newspaper and get that story says, you don't get it. Those people who are impressed by that are not going to vote for you. The people who aren't impressed by it are the people whose votes you actually need. That's not the kind of story you need. You need a story where you're dovetailing into their concerns And, you know, they've got a number of concerns. Freedom of speech, political correctness is one of those things. Jobs is another. They're more interested in jobs than they are in fancy wind farms, for example. Yet the LNP up here have gone for the doctor on renewable energy. They ought to be talking about dams. They ought to be talking about storage, because all this renewable energy is getting jammed into the system. There's no batteries there. So when the sun's not shining and when the wind's not blowing, it's good old-fashioned coal-fired power that's having to shoulder the task. And the problem is coal-fired power is not made to switch on and off at the click of your fingers. So that's creating all sorts of problems. They're not talking about those sorts of things. They're going the Labor agenda. And I think that's part of their problem in these outer urban, regional, commuter, working class areas.
Sounds similar to the problems that the Victorian Liberal opposition has had in the past. We've talked about the city of Brisbane being a Liberal stronghold, and that continued from when Campbell Newman resigned as Lord Mayor to become opposition leader. Graham Quirk was the Lord Mayor after him, and now the Lord Mayor is Adrian. How do you say?
Adrian Schrinner.
Recently got re-elected as well. What sort of makes that click that the Liberal Party has had such success in a city-centric council area?
Well, city councils are different from any other level of government. You're taking a very short historical view. So back in about 1972, I think it was, Clem Jones won such a large majority that there was only one opposition seat in the council. And that was a seat out in Indooroopilly, which at that stage was a up-and-coming rich area of town. But the whole of the rest of Brisbane was Clem Jones. Sally Ann Atkinson was the first to claw back from that. And she did reasonably well, but she only got, 2 terms? And then got bundled out by a no-name candidate called Jim Sawley, who then imprinted himself fairly strongly on the party. And it was really only after Jim went that Campbell managed to win. And Campbell was a minority Lord Mayor when he first won. And he had to work with David Hinchliffe, who led the Labor Party and who was his deputy mayor. Campbell did a good job, and so the council swung to Campbell, basically, and Graham managed to keep it going. So I think what you're seeing at a local government level in Brisbane is that there's a reward for good governance. It's also difficult to get rid of city council administrations because the media don't spend a lot of time covering them. So it's a very thankless task being opposition leader in the council because you hardly ever get anything in the paper, let alone on the front page. You've got to really have things going badly for you to stand a chance. So Sally Ann, when she got in, she had a rubbish strike, which she managed to leverage off. Roads, rates and rubbish, they were her slogans. When she lost, Jim Sawley was lucky enough to have a rubbish issue in that Sally Ann had determined she was going to put a waste transfer station at Roachdale in one of her better seats. And the effect of that rippled around the city. But more damaging to her was that at that time, they only revalued land every 5 years, I think it was. And they did the north side of the city 2 years before the council election. And their rates went up significantly because you levy rates on the basis of land valuation, or total rates that you need to raise divided by land valuations, then apportioned to your property in proportion to the value of your property. So everyone on the north side had a valuation leap. Their rates went up. Then the next year they did the south side. Well, that meant that your rates on the north side went down, but your rates on the south side went up. People were angry. Sally Ann didn't blame the state government as she should have done because they were in charge of valuations. She took it on the chin. And so she got blamed for the rate rises. That's what gave Jim Sawley his majority, and he only just got there. And then Sawley was in fairly safely because people saw him as being a good manager. And then at the end of that, he handed over to Tim Quinn. Tim was seen as being pretty lacklustre. People weren't that happy with what was happening in the council. And Campbell came along and basically he sold himself as the Energizer Bunny under the slogan, can do Newman or can do Campbell. But again, he only just fell in, showed that he could manage the place. He's cemented himself in, and the Liberals haven't lost a trick since. But it's good management. It's not partisan politics. When you look at the federal seats in Brisbane, we've gone from having only one seat back in 1983, the seat of Ryan, to now where we hold everything but Griffith and Lilly, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. Oh, you've got Rankin out on the, it's not really in Brisbane, it's in Logan City. You've got Milton Dick. But anyway, it's the majority of the federal seats now. That's an aberration in that, you know from history that you won't hold that for more than a couple of elections and it'll flip back, and it's quite capable of flipping back all the way. One of the phenomena in Brisbane is that we have a lot of marginal seats, and that's because we have a very hilly city. So what happened when Brisbane was being developed was that you, if you were wealthy, differentiated yourself from your neighbours by buying a property with a view. And if you're in a place like Melbourne where you don't have any hills and you don't have a lot of views, you differentiated yourself from people not as well off from you buying in Toorak, for example. So you bought in wealthy neighbourhoods, whereas here, much less of that happening. So again, East Brisbane, where I grew up, there were people at the top of the hill who had tennis courts because the top of the hill had a view. There were people up there who had ballrooms, not where I grew up, but at the top of the hill, so you've got a mix. And that makes a lot of the seats in Brisbane marginal. So you can have small movements and things will flick heavily the other way.
That's certainly not the case in Melbourne, as you alluded to. The west and the north is all safe Labor. The inner south and the east is safe Liberal, and then the swing is in the southeast along the Frankston and Pakenham areas. When the local government elections were held, there was also two state by-elections. There was a resignation of Labor's Joanne Miller in Bundabar, and also the LNP's Jan Stuckey in Currabin. And obviously
you need to work on your pronunciation, Tim.
They're
mate, that's Bundamba.
Bundamba.
And we call it Currumbin.
Currumbin. They're both Indigenous names, are they?
Well, I'm sure Currumbin is. I assume Bundamba is, yeah.
Okay, apologies then. But moving on to the by-elections, obviously to trigger one so close to a state election, they were both somewhat disgruntled, these MPs, and they were both by-elections were considered a test for the respective parties going into the state election. Yeah,
okay. So in both cases, you had resignations by members of parliament who were upset with their respective parties. So Bundamba is a seat to it's Ipswich and kind of east of Ipswich. And Joanne Miller was the member. She had a long-running feud with Paul Pusasali, who was the mayor of Ipswich and who is at Her Majesty's pleasure and up on charges. So basically, I think it's fairly safe to say Paul was corrupt, and there was a fair bit of corruption in the Ipswich City Council. and Joanne was telling anyone who listened that there were problems. But there weren't that many people that listened, and there were fewer people that would do anything about it. So she's been actually a little bit of a one-man crossbencher whilst being on the government benches. She's made some of the hits in the last state parliament, and ultimately she decided that she was going to give it away. She, in fact, in the last state election, she was notorious for being seen with Pauline Hanson.
Oh yes, we all remember that encounter.
Yeah, because Bundamba is part of the where the boundaries were in the seat of Oxley when Pauline won. So it's one nation heartland. So she resigned. Jan Stuckey was the member for Currumbin. She'd signalled that she wasn't recontesting this election, and she was unhappy with the party. She voted in favour of the government's abortion bills, and I think she came under a fair bit of pressure because of that, which she described as bullying. You know, my attitude is if you're in politics, it's all bullying, and if you can't stand it, you shouldn't have been there in the first place, and it's certainly not an excuse for a member of parliament to pull the plug. And you had your Julia Banks down there in Victoria, and I would have said the same thing to her. You know, you watch them in parliament, and all that yelling and jeering, that's
well, that's just what you see on camera.
Oh no, they do it off camera as well. You know, there's bullying. That's what it's all about. It's war without the bullets. So anyway, she pulled the plug, so Joanne Miller wasn't happy with the person who was pre-selected, even though she was the ETU representative, which theoretically puts her on the left of the party. She's a pretty right-wing candidate, and that's pretty right-wing traditional Labor territory. The guy they have put in as a genuine left-winger. He's a bit of a blow-in. He grew up at Redlands, even though I see from his maiden speech, which he delivered yesterday, that he's of Indigenous descent, and his homeland is just north of Bundamba. But anyway, he was basically a blow-in imposed on them, and she wasn't happy with that. And as far as I understand, didn't campaign for him, but certainly didn't campaign against him. Down in Currumbin, the local member had a successor picked out. The successor was actually, not sure that he was vetted out, strictly speaking. They have a vetting committee that looks at the background of people who put their hand up for pre-selection. I think he actually withdrew, but in any event, he was either vetted out or persuaded not to run, and Jan Stuckey was not happy with that. The woman who was pre-selected had put in her nomination thinking that the pre-selection wouldn't be till later and that Jan would be the candidate. She's a lady called Laura Gerber. She's a litigation lawyer. She lives at Elanora, which is in Palm Beach, but in the Currumbin electorate. She grew up in the area, and she was in fact a clubby at the Currumbin RSL. She is a member of the Currumbin RSL, but the Currumbin Surf Lifesaving Club. So, you know, she's a local, been in the area, but no background in the party. She got the pre-selection because there was no one else, and Jan Stuckey had precipitated this by-election. So she was, in a sense, an accidental candidate. But I've read her pre-selection, her maiden speech, and I think she might be a happy accidental candidate for them. So anyway, so you've got two electorates. The margin, the other thing I have to tell you is the margin that Joanne Miller had in Bundamba was about the third best, I think it was, in the state, 72% to 38. So 22% margin of safety there for Labor. Down in Currumbin, I think it was 3.5%, Jan Stuckey. So it was a marginal seat. In the end, in Bundamba, they had a 10% swing against them. Well, might have been 12, because I think he's on about 60% two-party preferred. Now, that is not a good result for Labor. It wasn't a good result for the LNP though. And this exemplifies what I'm saying about them not meshing with that kind of working class, lower middle class vote in regional, outer suburban areas. The Liberal Party got, from memory, about 13% of the vote there, about half of what One Nation got. One Nation were the runner-up. So in a state election, you'd expect that, you know, probably Labor will do better than the by-election, but not necessarily. And the beneficiary won't be the LNP, it'll be One Nation. Down in Currumbin, obviously the Liberal Party won. On second preferences, it was about a 2.5% swing against them. So they're in there just 50.5%, something like that, to Labor 49.5. You would expect Labor to go hard in the state elections. So it is by no means a laid down misere, and Mrs. Gerber will be on her own. So the campaign and the by-election was run by headquarters. Her next campaign, she'll have to run herself. Obviously, like every other candidate, she'll get attention from headquarters. And obviously, she'll be one of the key marginal seats that they'll be putting effort into. But it'll be a different situation. The other thing we should probably talk about is that the ALP is nobbling the LNP and the other minor parties at the moment. They have a bill in Parliament to limit how much you can spend in an electorate and to limit how much you can raise to spend in an electorate.
Is this modelled on the Victorian legislation that was passed before our 2018 state election?
It is, but it limits more severely the amount of money that you can spend. And it also potentially limits the range of third-party organisations that can come in and support you. So you've got to look beyond the complexities of the legislation. It's sold as we can't have money buying elections. And up here, they're worried that Clive Palmer might come in and spend a lot of money and cost them seats. So that's one issue. But last time the Caps were in, there was a by-election in Redcliffe. And the Newman government was in power. They hadn't got around to changing the legislation to remove the caps. I was shown the expenditure from that election, from that by-election. Labor Party and Liberal Party spent exactly the same amount of money. The LNP was outspent 7-1 because on top of the Labor Party expenditure, there were various unions and other theoretically independent groups. That's the situation we're going back to under this legislation. So they're limiting what the state parties can spend to about $150,000. If you're an independent candidate, you can't even spend that much because you don't have a party organisation behind you. So independents are at a further disadvantage. But the LNP, because they don't have union affiliates who can all go in and spend money, they'll be at a general disadvantage. And a seat like Currumbin, Mrs. Gerber will find herself with a number of unions in there spending up to the max, which I think is 58,000. So there were hundreds of thousands spent on the by-election. There'll only be 150,000 that the LNP can spend all up in Currumbin. The ALP will be able to spend 150,000 all up, and then you'll have any number of unions who can spend 58,000 on top of that. Now, you listeners might think 150,000 is a lot of money. Most of that money is actually going to be provided by the public because they're doubling the amount of public funding. So we're going to be paying for this rort. So that is going to make it very difficult for the LNP in those must-win seats, that the way to spend is going to be with the ALP. Whatever the ALP say is going to be with them because they have these union affiliates who will come in and do the hard work for them. And that's another factor which I haven't heard anyone talking about, but which will be a strong factor in the next election. If the LNP can't get their messaging right, they don't have a strong appeal to working class and lower middle class voters in those regional and commuter suburbs, and they don't have the firepower, they're in diabolicals.
We might finish our discussion by we've talked about the north-south divide in Queensland. There is a renewed northern Queensland separatist push. The Katter Party, they've put their lot behind it, and George Christensen and Matt Canavan, they're sort of flirting with that North Queensland could be its own state. It sort of seems to me that because WA secession, it's always been on the back of the agenda, something that's sort of dreamed about, but how would it actually happen?
Yeah, my mum was born in Townsville in 1922 and grew up in Cairns, and she went down to Melbourne probably about, I'm never quite sure, but 43 or 44, towards the end of the war, to be in the WAF. And then she came up to Brisbane in the 50s and lived here the rest of her life. But if you got her in a mood, she'd often talk about you Southerners. And she wasn't so much talking about you Southerners in Victoria, she was talking about people in Brisbane. So that I've got a bit of insight into that North Queensland instinct, which is very strongly that we're on our own up here, you people don't care about us, and when there is money, it's made up here and you spend it down there. That's basically the way they look at the world. And it was a strong feeling before Federation, and the Constitution allows for an additional state up there. But despite them thinking that all the money's raised up there, they raise money, but I think they'd be struggling to run themselves as a separate state. So it's one of those issues that pops up on a regular basis. But I think it's more a fantasy, and I think people up there know in their water that it is a fantasy, that it's not going to happen. Having said that, as a think tank, we can see prospects for secure power up there, and if you Victorians keep going the way you're going and keep pumping all that unreliable, so-called renewable energy into your system, if you refuse to countenance gas, and if you refuse to countenance nuclear, and if you don't invest in some pumped hydro, or battery technology doesn't improve extraordinarily quickly, then there's going to be a lot of industry looking for places to go. And North Queensland's got some prospects. We've still got reasonable coal-fired power in Australia, and there's some real hydro prospects in North Queensland. There's been some talk of the Bradfield scheme, and Sir Leo Hilscher, who was a legendary public servant here and is still a legend, but getting on, he and Sir Frank Moore have been pushing a new version of it, and some parts have actually got some legs, and they'll particularly have some legs if we can put some hydropower in there. But there's other hydropower possibilities without the Bradfield scheme happening. So you do that, there's plenty of land up there which could be used for industry. There's ports where you can export. And I think one of the things that held North Queensland back in the past was the climate. And of course, we didn't have air conditioners. We have air conditioners now. So that gets over part of the problem. The other problem you got in North Queensland is the weather. When I say weather, I'm thinking of cyclones and the wet season, which often closes roads off and makes industry difficult. So that's something which no amount of reliable power can cope with. So I think it's still got problems, but it's also it's got opportunities, and it's never really realised its promise. Perhaps in the modern world, that promise is coming closer, but I think it will be realised more quickly as part of a unified Queensland rather than a Queensland that's been split into, it wouldn't be split into two, it'd be kind of split into 75, 25%.
I think the pandemic has reminded a lot of Australians, despite a lot of power drifting to be centralised in Canberra, the states still have a lot of power on their own, and so I think that's got a lot of people thinking about issues like should there be more states. We were going to talk a bit about media change, because you also run a alternative media website, Online Opinion. Though we've run out of time.
I'm happy to come back and talk about that another time, Tim.
It's an issue that will still be in the news. Obviously, there's a lot of media outlets have had cutbacks, redundancies. I think sort of turbocharged by the pandemic, or maybe it's being used.
No, I think they're using
an excuse.
I think it's just being used as an excuse. News was always going to cut back on their regional newspapers and stop printing a lot of them. And they pushed into some areas too with online-only presence as well. So, for example, down in Redlands, there's a Redland Bay Times, which has been going for a long time, but news is down there online. So, yeah, we're seeing the slow collapse of the news industry as we knew it, and it hasn't really reinvented itself in a form which is sustainable. I think the form that is sustainable is there, but they need to employ far fewer journalists producing the amount of dross that they're producing at the moment. And they need to produce information that people are prepared to actually pay for. They've damaged themselves by giving all the material that they produce away for free. And now belatedly they're coming to the party and trying to put up paywalls and so on. But even then they do it in a half-hearted way, and you can generally get the content without paying for it. And unless they're prepared to produce a product that people will pay for, then they won't be able to employ people. That's the iron law of economics and business.
I'd agree with that summary as well, that if you have to have enough of a loyal and a loyal customer base that values your work to want to pay for it. That is going to be the future, not just of print, but also broadcast as well, with all the streaming services. Your website is onlineopinion.com.au, and the Australian Institute for Progress, it's not a .org, it's aip.asn.au. That's
right. Thanks very much, Tim. And Online Opinion, if I can just have a brief advertisement for it, it's one of the few sites, news sites or opinion sites in the country that tries to act as a platform for all points of view. So the idea isn't, I obviously have a particular point of view, but we frequently publish articles from people who come from quite different points of view. I've got a regular contributor who's associated with WWF. We have Greenpeace people, and we obviously have people from my side of the spectrum as well. But it's a site where we don't censor. We're not like YouTube or Facebook, taking information down because we don't agree with it.
And you also write for The Spectator as well on occasions.
Well, I write for The Australian, The Fin Review, Spectator, The Courier Mail on occasions. It's difficult to find the time, but The Spectator at the moment is particularly keen for the stuff that I'm writing. So I'm happy to give them material. Should be something up tomorrow, I hope.
Oh, well, I've got their paywall now is quite strong now. That I've noticed that you can get around still a lot of the paywalls, but the spectator.com.au one, that's quite difficult, so I may not be able to read it.
Well, I'd encourage you to subscribe, and then they might be able to pay their contributors even more money.
Well, there's so much more to unpack with that, but thank you for giving your time tonight to WilmsFront and the Unshackled. And well, if we need any Queensland politics expertise closer to election day, we know where to go.
I'd be happy to help out a colleague in the alternative media space.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.
All right, that brings us to the end of the another now weekly edition of WilmsFront. So it'll always be now 6:30 p.m. Melbourne time on the WilmsFront YouTube channel, and also the Tim Wilms D-Live. Apologies again, I didn't get to the entropy questions, even though I only had one featured guest tonight. Graham, has got so much knowledge about Queensland politics that he wants to share as much of it as he can, and of course I'm willing willing to indulge that and have him share it with you, my audience. But we ended up going for nearly the full 2 hours there. It's almost time for Deb Beltran live. So I'll try to summarize briefly. Obviously, it's broken today that, China, they've delivered another insult to Australia. Their state media has labelled Australia the dog of the United States. So tomorrow night on the Uncuckables, it'll be, as always, myself, David Hiscock, but we'll also have making his debut on this particular show, Dave Lee, who's been the resident WilmsFront China expert, but he's going to come on the Uncuckables since China's insults and bullying of us has increased in the past week. And then rounding out the, of course, Uncuckables, 8:30 p.m. Melbourne time on the show, YouTube and D-Live. And then rounding out the week, it is Trad Tasman Talk, 6 p.m. Melbourne time on the Unshackled YouTube channel. There could be a new New Zealand opposition leader by the time I speak with Duo on Friday night, because there's been a devastating poll for the New Zealand National Party, Jacinda Ardern's Labor Party, 56% primary vote. They'd be able to govern in their own right. National Party, 30%, Greens, 5%, New Zealand First, less than 3%. Jacinda Ardern as preferred Prime Minister, she is up to 65%, Simon Bridges at 7%. All right, Deb Beltran Live is just about to start now, so I'll sign off this week's edition of WilmsFront, and I will see you all tomorrow night. Keep checking the Unshackled.net. We are building our new Rewind history section, and we are also going to be building our new cultural review section in addition to our rundown news blog and also our recourse essays as well. So it's all very exciting on the Unshackled.net front as well. I'm glad I'm able to make time to do some of that publishing work and editing. So I'm finally finding a getting back to some balance, which I'm quite pleased about, and hopefully you are as well. All right, good night, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to WilmsFront. Visit timwilms.com or Rational Rise TV to view the archive of episodes. And keep visiting the Unshackled.net to view all our shows. And to keep up with the latest real